The sun climbed over the mountains of Moab, casting long shadows across the plains where Israel had camped for the final time under Moses' leadership. For 40 years the great prophet had led them through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, through rebellion and judgment and miraculous provision. But now, at the edge of the Promised Land with the Jordan River visible in the distance, Moses would go no further. The reason was etched in Israel's collective memory. Decades earlier, at a place called Meribah, when the people had complained about water and Moses had been commanded to speak to a rock, the old prophet had instead struck it twice in anger. Water had gushed forth, God's mercy providing despite human failure, but the act of disobedience had carried consequences. Moses, who had interceded for Israel countless times, who had turned aside God's wrath and pleaded for his people's preservation, would not cross the Jordan. He would see the land from a distance but never set foot in it. It was a sobering reminder that even the greatest servants of God are not above his word, that leadership carries accountability, that proximity to the holy demands greater, not lesser, obedience. Now Moses climbed Mount Nebo, that peak overlooking the Jordan Valley, and from its summit God showed him the entire land, north to Dan, west to the Mediterranean, south to the Negev. Every promise made to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob spread before his eyes in panoramic view. He had brought them this far. Someone else would take them the rest of the way. Moses died there on the mountain at 120 years old, his eye undimmed and his vigour unabated. God himself buried him in an unknown location, and Israel mourned for 30 days. The era of the great prophet leader had ended. The question now was who could possibly fill such a vacancy? The answer had been prepared for decades. Joshua stood among the people, feeling the weight of what was coming. He was no young man, likely in his 80s, perhaps even 90 years old. Yet he was about to embark on a campaign of conquest that would require the strength and stamina of a warrior in his prime. He had been born in Egyptian slavery, had witnessed the plagues, had walked through the Red Sea as a young man. His original name had been Hoshea, meaning salvation, but Moses had renamed him Yehoshua, Joshua, adding the divine name to the front, the Lord saves. It was a name that would prove prophetic. 40 years earlier, Joshua had been one of 12 spies sent to scout the Promised Land. While 10 had returned with reports of giants and fortified cities, spreading fear and unbelief throughout the camp, only Joshua and Caleb had stood firm. They had seen the same obstacles but reached a different conclusion. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them. For that faith, for that refusal to join the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, they alone of their generation had been promised entry into Canaan. Everyone else aged 20 and above at the time of that rebellion had been sentenced to die in the wilderness. Now, 4 decades later, the sentence had been carried out. The generation that had refused to trust God lay buried in the desert behind them. Their children stood at the Jordan, seasoned by wilderness hardship, shaped by years of following the pillar of cloud and fire, ready to attempt what their parents had refused. And Joshua, the spy who had believed when others doubted, Moses' aide who had stood beside him through rebellion and judgment, was about to become the commander of a nation on the threshold of war. The transition was not merely political or military, it was profoundly spiritual. God himself spoke to Joshua, commissioning him with words that would be repeated through the centuries, becoming the battle cry of every leader who has faced impossible odds and relied on divine strength rather than human might. Moses, my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. The words were blunt, almost harsh. Moses is dead. No extended eulogy, no prolonged mourning period. The work continues. The mission proceeds. One leader falls, another rises. The purposes of God do not pause for human grief. But with the command came a promise, one that transformed military strategy into theological certainty. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. The boundaries were vast, far exceeding what Israel would actually conquer, even in their greatest days under David and Solomon. But the principle was established. Possession would follow presence. Conquest would mirror faith's footsteps. Wherever they went in obedience, God had already granted them victory. The land was theirs by promise. It would become theirs by action. Then came the words that would define Joshua's leadership and echo through his story like a refrain. Be strong and courageous. 3 times God spoke this command, each with slightly different emphasis, each addressing a different dimension of the challenge ahead. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. This was courage for leadership, the strength to guide a restless, rebellious people who had tested Moses to the breaking point and would surely test his successor. Joshua needed courage not just to face Canaanite armies, but to lead the sometimes fractious tribes of Israel, to make difficult decisions, to bear the weight of command when battles went poorly or the people complained. Then again, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This was courage for obedience. Military genius would not be enough. Tactical brilliance would fail without spiritual fidelity. Joshua was being commissioned as a warrior, yes, but also as a guardian of Torah. The Book of the Law was not merely a religious text to be consulted on Sabbaths. It was operational manual for conquest, the strategic document that would determine success or failure. The command became even more specific. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Day and night. Constant meditation, not casual familiarity, but deep immersion in God's word. Joshua the warrior was being commanded to be Joshua the student, the contemplative, the one whose strength came not from physical training alone, but from spiritual formation. His sword arm would be guided by his knowledge of Scripture. His battle plans would be shaped by his meditation on God's commands. And a third time, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. This was courage rooted in presence, not Joshua's presence, but God's. The command was imperative, but the foundation was promise. Why should he be strong? Not because he was naturally brave or exceptionally gifted, but because God would be with him. Wherever he went, into battle, into negotiations, into the uncertainties of leading a nation, the presence of God would accompany him. It was the same promise given to Moses at the burning bush, the same assurance offered to the patriarchs, the same certainty that would later be given to the prophets, and ultimately embodied in Jesus, called Emmanuel, God with us. Leadership in God's kingdom has always depended not on the leader's inherent qualities, but on divine companionship. Joshua received these words, standing perhaps where Moses had stood so many times to receive instructions, feeling the enormousness of the task ahead. He was not replacing Moses. No one could do that. But he was continuing Moses' work, taking up the mission where the prophet had left it, leading Israel into the next chapter of God's unfolding plan. The people needed to hear that leadership had transferred, that God's purposes had not died with Moses. Joshua called the officers together and gave them their orders. Pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for within 3 days you are to pass over this Jordan to go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. 3 days. The countdown had begun. 40 years of wandering were about to end. The generation that had believed the evil report of the faithless spies was gone. The children who had heard Joshua and Caleb's minority opinion, we should go up and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it, were now adults, hardened by desert life, ready to attempt what their parents had refused. But there was a question that needed answering. Would the people follow Joshua as they had followed Moses? Would they accept his leadership or challenge his authority as they had challenged Moses countless times The response from the tribes was immediate and decisive. "All that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your commandment and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous." It was an oath of allegiance that recognized both the transfer of authority and the stakes involved. This was not democracy where leadership could be questioned at every turn. This was covenant community where God appointed leaders and the people's responsibility was obedience. The phrase, "only be strong and courageous," coming from their lips back to Joshua created a powerful moment. The people encouraging their leader with the same words God had spoken to him. They would need each other's courage in the days ahead. The task before them was daunting in the extreme. Canaan was not empty wilderness waiting to be settled. It was a land of fortified cities and trained armies, of Hittites and Amorites, Canaanites and Perizzites, Hivites and Jebusites. It was a land of giants, the Anakim whose size and strength had terrified the previous generation. It was a land of pagan worship and dark practices, where child sacrifice to Molech was commonplace, where cult prostitution was religious ritual, where the accumulation of sin over centuries had reached the level that demanded divine judgment. Israel was being sent not merely to claim territory, but to execute judgment on cultures that had corrupted themselves beyond redemption. The command would be Hiram, devoted destruction, where entire cities would be put under the ban, their inhabitants and possessions dedicated to God through annihilation. To modern ears, the concept is troubling, even horrifying. But the ancient audience understood it as the outworking of divine justice after 400 years of patience. God had told Abraham that his descendants would return to this land only when the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. That time had come. Joshua understood the moral and spiritual dimensions of what lay ahead. This was not conquest for the sake of empire building or the enrichment of Israel. This was the execution of divine sentence on peoples who had filled their land with abominations. Israel was the instrument, but judgment was God's prerogative. And if Israel failed to execute that judgment completely, if they compromised with Canaanite culture or absorbed their religious practices, they would themselves come under similar judgment eventually. The parallels to spiritual warfare were inescapable. The conquest of Canaan was not merely ancient history, but a picture of the Christian life, the battle against sin and spiritual forces, the need for complete devotion rather than compromise, the danger of allowing what should be destroyed to remain as a thorn in the side. Paul would later write about pulling down strongholds and taking every thought captive. Joshua was about to demonstrate that principle in physical form. As the 3-day countdown began, the camp bustled with preparation. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, families made ready for the crossing. The Ark of the Covenant, that golden box containing the tablets of the law, Aaron's rod, and a jar of manna, was prepared for transport. It would go before them into the Jordan, just as it had led them through the wilderness. Joshua himself spent time in prayer and planning, knowing that the first challenge was not military, but hydrological. The Jordan River, swollen with spring floods from melting snow in the Lebanon mountains, stood between them and Canaan. It was not the Red Sea in scale, but it was formidable enough, too deep to wade, too swift to swim, too wide to bridge with available materials. 2 million people with livestock and possessions needed to cross. Human engineering would be insufficient. They would need another miracle, and miracle, as Joshua had learned over 40 years of following God through the wilderness, was simply the normal mode of operation when God's people walked in obedience to his word. The old soldier, for that is what he had become, seasoned by years of desert warfare against Amalekites and Midianites, trained under Moses' leadership, shaped by encounters with the divine, stood on the bank of the Jordan as evening fell. Behind him, the camp of Israel stretched across the plains. Before him, the river rushed toward the Dead Sea. Beyond it, the hills of Canaan rose against the sky, holding both promise and threat. Tomorrow the reconnaissance would begin. Spies would cross to gather intelligence on Jericho. that ancient fortress city that guarded the gateway into Canaan. Then, in 3 days, the entire nation would follow. Moses was dead. Joshua was alive. The wilderness was behind them. Canaan was ahead. And the God who had parted the Red Sea was about to demonstrate that his power had not diminished, that his promises had not expired, that what he had begun in Egypt he would complete in Canaan. The torch had passed, the soldier had become the shepherd, and the conquest of faith was about to begin. Self, a marginal figure in Jericho's society, yet positioned at the literal boundary between inside and outside, between the doomed city and the land beyond. Her profession would normally have made her an unlikely hero of faith, yet she would prove to have more spiritual insight than all of Jericho's rulers and priests combined. Word reached the king that Israelite spies had entered the city and gone to Rahab's house. Guards came pounding on her door, demanding she produce the men. But Rahab had already hidden them under stalks of flax drying on her roof, and she sent the soldiers on a false trail, claiming the men had left at dusk before the city gates closed, and suggesting pursuit toward the Jordan fords might still catch them. When the soldiers had gone, Rahab climbed to the roof and spoke words that revealed just how thoroughly the reputation of Israel's God had travelled. "I know that the Lord has given you the land," she began, "and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you." The faith in that statement is staggering. She knew, not hoped, not suspected, but knew with certainty that Jericho's doom was sealed. And her knowledge came from testimony, from stories that had spread throughout Canaan like wildfire, stories that had kindled terror in hardened warriors and caused kings to lose sleep. "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." 40 years had passed since the Red Sea. An entire generation had died in the wilderness. Yet the memory of that miracle had not faded. The testimony had spread, mutated, grown into legend that was somehow more accurate than legend usually is. Rahab had never seen the parted waters, never witnessed manna falling from heaven, never observed the pillar of cloud and fire. But she had heard, and hearing had produced faith. Faith that put her at odds with her own people, faith that made her willing to betray her city to save herself and her family. Her theology was more sound than many who claimed to worship the God of Israel. She understood that the Lord was not merely Israel's tribal deity, but the God of heaven and earth, sovereign over all. She recognized that opposing him was futile, that resistance was suicide, and she acted on that knowledge, placing her life at risk by hiding the spies and asking for mercy in return. "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." The spies gave their oath. Her life for theirs, her protection for theirs. When Israel attacked, she must gather her family into her house and hang a scarlet cord from her window, the same window from which she would lower the spies to escape down the outer wall. The cord would mark the house for salvation, just as blood on doorposts had marked Hebrew homes during the final plague in Egypt. The parallel was unmistakable. Judgment was coming to Jericho as it had come to Egypt. Those marked by faith would be spared. Those who refused to believe would be destroyed. Rahab understood the terms and accepted them. She lowered the spies down the wall under cover of darkness, advising them to hide in the hill country for 3 days until the search parties gave up, then make their way back to the Israelite camp. The men departed, and Rahab hung the scarlet cord from her window, a crimson declaration of faith against the coming storm. The spies returned to Joshua and reported not merely the layout of Jericho's defences, but something far more valuable, the mental state of its defenders. "Truly, the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us." The battle was already half won. Terror had preceded them. The psychological advantage was total. Joshua received the report and made his decision. The time had come. 3 days of preparation had passed. The nation was ready. The ark was prepared. The priests who would carry it had been consecrated. All that remained was the crossing itself. The Jordan River at harvest time was nothing like the placid stream it became in summer. Spring floods, fed by melting snow from Mount Hermon and the mountains of Lebanon, swelled it to perhaps a mile wide in places, currents swift and treacherous. The timing seemed deliberately difficult, as if God were emphasizing that this crossing, like the Red Sea before it, would require divine intervention. Joshua called the people together and gave them their instructions. The Ark of the Covenant would go before them, carried by the priests. The people were to follow at a distance of about 2,000 cubits, roughly a kilometre, maintaining space between themselves and the Ark, treating it with reverence, approaching the holy with appropriate caution. They were to sanctify themselves, for the next day the Lord would do wonders among them. To the priests, Joshua gave the command that would require extraordinary faith. Take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on before the people. Not after the waters had parted, not when the path was clear, but first leading the way, stepping into flood-stage water with no guarantee that anything supernatural would occur. This was the progression of faith that Israel was learning. At the Red Sea they had been passive observers. Moses stretched out his staff, the waters parted, and they walked through on a path God had made without their participation. But here at the Jordan, the priests would have to step into the water before it parted. Their feet touching the flood would be the trigger for the miracle. It was a greater test, requiring more active faith, demanding that they move forward in obedience before seeing the result. The morning came, the ark was lifted. The priests moved toward the river, the entire nation watching to see what would happen. The waters rushed past, brown and churning, carrying debris from upstream. Death waited in those currents for anyone foolish enough to attempt crossing by human means. The priest's feet touched the water's edge, then stepped into the shallows, then moved deeper into the current, water rising to their ankles, their calves, their knees, and the water stopped. Not gradually, not slowly, but decisively. Upstream, at a town called Adam, perhaps 15 miles away, the waters piled up, heaping upon themselves, held back by invisible force. Downstream, the water that had already passed continued flowing toward the Dead Sea, draining away until the riverbed stood exposed, not muddy, but dry ground, firm enough to bear the weight of millions of feet and countless animals. The priests bearing the ark moved to the middle of the riverbed and stood there, on dry ground in the heart of what should have been raging flood. And as they stood, Israel crossed. Tribe by tribe, family by family, the entire nation passed through the Jordan on solid ground with priests and arks stationed in the centre, a living testimony to God's faithfulness planted in the midst of the impossible. The symbolism was profound, deliberately echoing the Red Sea while introducing new dimensions. The crossing was baptism, the death of the old wilderness identity and birth of a new conquest identity. Behind them lay 40 years of wandering, of manna and quail, of water from rocks and clothes that did not wear out. Ahead lay warfare and settlement, harvest and planting, the establishing of a nation in the land God had promised. But the crossing itself was more than transition. It was affirmation of Joshua's leadership in terms the entire nation could see. God had told him, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." The Jordan crossing was that exhortation, the public demonstration that the same God who had parted the Red Sea for Moses was now parting the Jordan for Joshua. The continuity of divine presence and power was undeniable. As the crossing proceeded, Joshua called forward 12 men, one from each tribe chosen beforehand for this specific task. He commanded them to go back to where the priests stood in the Jordan's midst, to take up stones from that very place, 12 stones corresponding to the 12 tribes, and carry them to the camp where they would set them up as a memorial. The stones were not small, each man carried one on his shoulder, substantial enough to require effort, significant enough to endure. These were to be permanent testimony, physical evidence that could be pointed to in future generations when children asked, "What do these stones mean?" The answer would be the story. When the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. But there was a second memorial that often goes unnoticed. Joshua himself set up 12 stones in the Jordan, in the place where the priests' feet had stood. These would be covered when the waters returned, invisible to human eye yet known to God, a hidden testimony in the depths, marking the exact spot where the impossible had occurred. One memorial visible to man, another visible only to heaven. Both necessary, both significant. The entire nation crossed. The fighting men, 40,000 armed for war, crossed first, ready for combat the moment they reached the far shore. Then the tribes, the families, the children, the elderly, the flocks and herds. Hours it must have taken, perhaps most of the day, but the priest remained standing in the riverbed with the ark, the waters held back upstream until the last person had crossed safely. Only when everyone was on the western bank did Joshua command the priest to come up out of the Jordan. They climbed the far bank, bearing the ark up from the dry riverbed. The moment their feet touched dry ground on the Canaan side, the waters returned. Scripture describes it with a vivid language. The waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. The flood came back with a rush, filling the channel, returning to its harvest-time fullness as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. 2 million people had crossed on dry ground. 12 stones from the riverbed now sat in their camp, and Israel had learned that their God's power had not diminished, that his faithfulness had not expired, that the same divine presence that had guided their parents now guided them. They made camp at a place called Gilgal, setting up the 12 stones as memorial, and there, on the edge of Canaan with Jericho visible in the distance, Joshua performed a ceremony that was both physically painful and spiritually significant. He circumcised the men of Israel. The entire generation born in the wilderness had not been circumcised. During the wandering years, the sign of the covenant had been neglected, not because of rebellion, but because of the unsettled nature of their existence. Now, on the threshold of conquest, the covenant sign had to be restored. They were entering the land as the people of God, marked by the covenant, distinguishable from the nations around them. The circumcision left the army vulnerable, the men incapacitated for days, unable to fight if attacked. It was a moment of profound faith, trusting that God would protect them during their weakness. The parallel to Christian experience is clear. Sometimes God calls his people to spiritual renewal at precisely the moment when it seems most risky, when enemies threaten and circumstances demand action rather than reflection. But the renewal was essential. God's word to Joshua captured the significance. "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." Gilgal, the name means rolling, marked the removal of shame, the ending of the wilderness identity, the completion of the exodus that had begun at the Red Sea. They were no longer refugees from Egypt. They were no longer wilderness wanderers. They were the army of the living God, circumcised and consecrated, standing in the promised land. And then came another milestone. They celebrated Passover on the plains of Jericho, the 14th day of the month, precisely as commanded in the law. But this Passover was different. For the first time in 40 years they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain from Canaan's harvest. The next day, the manna stopped. The timing was exact, almost shocking in its precision. For 40 years, 6 days a week, manna had fallen from heaven. It had been their primary food source, the daily evidence of God's provision, the miracle that sustained millions in a landscape that could not naturally support them. Some Israelites had never known anything else. Born in the wilderness, raised on heaven's bread, eating the same thing year after year. But now the manna ceased. The day after they ate from Canaan's produce, the bread from heaven stopped falling. God had provided supernaturally when natural provision was impossible. Now that they were in a land flowing with milk and honey, able to harvest and plant and reap, the supernatural provision ended. It was not abandonment, but graduation, not withdrawal, but maturation. They would still depend on God, for rain in season, for blessing on crops, for protection from enemies, but the form of dependence would shift from miraculous to ordinary, from spectacular to sustainable. The lessons of Gilgal were cumulative and profound. The Jordan crossing had proven God's power and Joshua's authority. The circumcision had restored covenant identity. The Passover had connected this generation to their heritage, reminding them of Egypt's bondage and God's deliverance. The cessation of manna had marked the transition from wilderness provision to land blessing. They were ready. The army was consecrated. The people were positioned. Jericho loomed before them, its walls massive and intimidating, its gates shut tight against the Israelite threat. Inside those walls, Rahab waited with scarlet cord hanging from her window, faith manifest in crimson thread. Outside, Israel encamped, armed and eager, wondering how they would possibly breach defences that seemed impregnable. Joshua knew they could not do it by human means. Siege engines they did not possess. Scaling ladders would be cut down. Battering rams would fail against walls so thick that houses were built into them. The solution would have to come from God, and it would have to be unmistakable, something so clearly supernatural that no one, Israelite or Canaanite, could attribute it to human cleverness or military might. As the soldier leader walked near Jericho, perhaps scouting the walls and considering strategy, he looked up and saw something that made him stop. A man stood before him with a drawn sword ready for battle. Joshua's response was immediate. Was this figure friend or foe, Israelite or Canaanite? Are you for us or for our adversaries? The answer would change everything about how Joshua understood the conquest that lay ahead. The figure before him was no ordinary soldier. He was the commander of the army of the Lord, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself, come to make clear who was really in charge of this campaign. The armies of heaven had arrived. The conquest of Canaan was about to begin, and the walls of Jericho, massive and ancient and seemingly eternal, were about to learn what every enemy of God eventually discovers. No fortress stands against him, no defense holds when he commands its fall, no power on earth resists when heaven goes to war. Joshua stood face to face with the figure holding the drawn sword, and in that moment of encounter, the entire nature of the conquest was redefined. This was no ordinary warrior, no human commander offering alliance. The figure's response to Joshua's question carried weight that made the soldier leader fall to his face in reverence. "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." The answer was both correction and revelation. Joshua had asked the wrong question. The issue was not whether this divine warrior was on Israel's side or their enemy's side. The question was whether Joshua and Israel were on God's side. The commander had not come to join Israel's campaign. Israel was joining his. The armies of heaven were already at work. Joshua and his forces were simply being given the privilege of participating in what God was doing. Joshua's response was immediate and appropriate. He fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, then asked the question of a servant to his master, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" The commander's reply echoed another famous encounter from Israel's history. "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." Moses at the burning bush had received the same command. Now Joshua, standing near Jericho, received it again. The holy ground was not determined by geography but by divine presence. Wherever God chooses to manifest himself becomes sacred space, demanding reverence and the removal of anything that separates the human from the holy. Sandals, contact with the dust of a fallen world, must be removed when standing before the Eternal. Joshua removed his sandals and stood barefoot before the commander of the Lord's army. What followed was not recorded in detail, but the battle plan for Jericho was revealed, and it was unlike anything in the annals of ancient warfare. There would be no siege engines, no scaling ladders, no battering rams. There would be a parade. For 6 days the army would march around the city once per day, not attacking, not building siege works, simply walking in formation around the walls. 7 priests would carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Ark of the Covenant. The ark itself would process around the city carried by priests, while the armed guard marched ahead and the rear guard followed behind. Complete silence would be maintained except for the sound of the trumpets. No battle cry, no shouting, no noise from the ranks, just the eerie sound of ram's horns and the tramp of feet. On the 7th day the pattern would change, 7 times around the city instead of once, and then, at Joshua's command, the people would shout. A great shout, loud and unified, and the walls would fall. It was absurd by any military standard. Walls did not collapse from noise. Fortifications did not fail because people walked around them. If anything, the strategy seemed designed to demonstrate Israel's helplessness, to give Jericho's defenders time to prepare, to waste energy on ritual rather than assault. But this was precisely the point. The conquest had to be conducted in a way that made divine intervention undeniable. Human strategy was being deliberately excluded so that no one could claim human ingenuity had won the day. The number 7 dominated the plan. 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days, 7 circuits on the 7th day. It was the number of completion, of divine perfection, of God's finished work. Jericho would fall not by human might but by divine decree, and the numerical pattern would emphasize that this was heaven's work from beginning to end. Joshua returned to the camp and called the people together. He repeated the instructions exactly as he had received them, adding one critical element. The city and everything in it would be placed under the ban, devoted to destruction. This was here, the first fruits of Canaan dedicated entirely to God. No plunder could be taken, no spoils claimed. Everything in Jericho belonged to the Lord. Silver and gold would go into his treasury. Everything else would be destroyed. The exception was Rahab and her family. Because of her faith, because she had hidden the spies and cast her lot with Israel's God, she and everyone gathered in her house would be spared. The scarlet cord hanging from her window would mark them for salvation, as blood on doorposts had marked Hebrew homes in Egypt. The march began on the first day. The army rose early, assembled in formation, and began the circuit of Jericho. The order of march was precise. Armed guard in front, then 7 priests with 7 trumpets blowing continuous blasts, then the Ark of the Covenant, then the rear guard. Behind them, likely at the distance prescribed for following the Ark, came the rest of Israel, watching, waiting, wondering if their commander had lost his mind or if something miraculous was about to unfold. Inside Jericho, defenders lined the walls, watching the strange procession. At first, they might have expected an attack. Israel's army was moving into position. This must be the prelude to assault. But the army simply marched around the city in silence. They only sound the haunting notes of the ram's horn trumpets, then returned to their camp. No attack, no siege works, no violence. The psychological effect must have been unnerving. Why were they doing this? What was the purpose? The silence was oppressive. broken only by rhythmic footsteps and the sustained trumpet blasts. It was like watching a funeral procession, but the city was not yet dead. The sound of the trumpets, traditionally used in Israel for religious festivals, for the year of Jubilee, for calling assemblies, added to the sense that something beyond normal warfare was occurring. The second day, the march repeated. Same formation, same silence, same circuit, then return to camp. The third day, the same. By the fourth day, Jericho's defenders might have begun to relax slightly. Perhaps this was simply intimidation, psychological warfare meant to frighten them into surrender. Perhaps Israel's God had no power to actually breach the walls. They were safe behind their fortifications. Let the Hebrews march. It changed nothing. But on Jericho's walls, if anyone was paying attention, they might have noticed one house where a scarlet cord hung from a window. And in that house, a woman and her family waited with faith that the God of Israel would keep his promise, that when judgment fell on the city, they would be spared. Rahab had staked everything on the word of two spies and the character of the God they served. While her neighbours watched the Israelite procession with growing contempt or diminishing fear, she watched with growing certainty that deliverance was coming. The fifth day, the sixth day, the pattern continued. The discipline required of Israel was extraordinary. Imagine being a soldier, weapons ready, facing an enemy city, and being commanded to simply walk around it in silence for 6 consecutive days. No glory in that, no opportunity for valour, no chance to distinguish yourself in combat, just obedience to instructions that seemed to make no tactical sense. But this was the lesson God was teaching. Victory in his kingdom comes through obedience, not through conventional wisdom or military brilliance. Faith means following commands even when they seem absurd, trusting that God's strategy is superior to human planning. The warriors who conquered Canaan needed to learn that their strength came not from their sword arms, but from their submission to divine authority. The seventh day arrived. Israel rose early. Joshua would later describe it as at the dawn of day. And this time the march was different. Once around, as before. Then instead of returning to camp, they began a second circuit, then a third. Jericho's defenders must have realized something was different. 7 times the Israelite army marched around the city, 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets, the Ark of the Covenant processing around the walls, the people following in absolute silence. The tension built with each circuit. Whatever was going to happen would happen today. The pattern was reaching completion. 7 days, 7 circuits, 7 trumpets. The number of divine perfection was being fulfilled. On the 7th circuit, as the procession completed its final lap around the city, Joshua gave the command, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The sound that erupted from Israel must have been deafening. 2 million voices held silent for 6.5 days, released in one unified shout of triumph and faith. It was not the shout of warriors charging into battle. It was the shout of a people declaring victory before they had won it, claiming by faith what God had promised, speaking into reality what he had decreed. And the walls fell. Not gradually crumbling, not weakened by the marching and then collapsing. The text is clear. The wall fell down flat. The Hebrew is emphatic. The wall fell beneath itself, straight down, as if the stones lost all structural integrity simultaneously. The massive fortifications that had stood for centuries, that were thick enough to have houses built into them, that represented the finest defensive architecture of the ancient world, they collapsed in an instant. Archaeological debates have raged about Jericho for decades. Some excavations suggest evidence of walls that fell outward and were burned, dating to roughly the right period. Others dispute the findings, but the text leaves no ambiguity about what happened. God brought down the walls in a display of power that could not be attributed to human effort. The city was defenceless in a moment, open to conquest not by siege but by miracle. Israel charged straight into the city, every man running forward over the rubble of the collapsed walls. The command was clear. Everything in the city was devoted to destruction. Man, woman, child, livestock, all were put to death. The silver and gold, the vessels of bronze and iron, were taken for the treasury of the Lord. Everything else was burned. The brutality troubles modern readers, and rightly so. The complete destruction of a city's population is horrific by any measure. But the ancient audience understood this as the execution of divine judgment on a people whose sin had reached the point of no return. Jericho was the first city of Canaan, the entry point, and it was being made an example. The judgment was complete because the corruption was complete. Child sacrifice, cult prostitution, violence and oppression. The sins of the Canaanites had been accumulating for 400 years, and the patience of God had reached its limit. Israel was the instrument of that judgment, but they were also being taught a lesson about the seriousness of sin and the holiness of God. If they adopted Canaan's practices, if they absorbed its culture and worshipped its gods, the same judgment that fell on Jericho would eventually fall on them. The conquest was meant to be both justice on the wicked and warning to the righteous. But in the midst of judgment, mercy was preserved. As the city burned, Joshua sent the 2 spies who had lodged with Rahab to bring her and her family out safely. They went to her house, miraculously still standing despite being built into the wall that had collapsed, and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. The scarlet cord had marked them for salvation. The faith of one woman had saved her entire household. Rahab and her family were placed outside the camp of Israel, not yet fully integrated, but preserved, protected, given time to be instructed in the ways of the Lord. She would eventually be fully incorporated into Israel, marrying a man named Salmon from the tribe of Judah. Her name would appear in the genealogy of King David, and centuries later in the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. The prostitute from Jericho who had faith when her entire city had none would become the great-great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king and an ancestor of the Messiah. The writer of Hebrews would later include her in the Hall of Faith. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. James would cite her as an example of faith proven by works. Was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Her story became testimony that faith, not ethnicity or moral perfection, determines who belongs to God's people. Jericho burned to the ground. Joshua pronounced a curse on anyone who would attempt to rebuild it. Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. Centuries later, in the days of King Ahab, a man named Hiel of Bethel would attempt the rebuilding and lose both his firstborn and youngest son in the process, fulfilling Joshua's curse exactly. But on that day, as smoke rose from Jericho's ruins and Israel stood surveying the impossible victory God had given them, the message was clear. The conquest had begun, and it had begun with undeniable divine intervention. No one in Israel could claim they had conquered Jericho by superior tactics or military might. No one in Canaan could dismiss what had happened as natural occurrence. The walls had fallen at a shout, at the blast of trumpets, at the completion of 7 days of obedient marching. God had fought for Israel, and the first great fortress of the Promised Land had fallen without a conventional battle. The fame of Joshua spread throughout the land. Word travelled fast in the ancient Near East. A city's walls had collapsed. The Israelite God had demonstrated power beyond anything the Canaanite gods could match. The army of former slaves was now an unstoppable force backed by supernatural might. Kings and rulers throughout Canaan began to calculate whether to fight or flee, whether to form coalitions or seek terms of peace. Terror, which Rahab had described as already present in Jericho, now spread throughout the land. But Israel's euphoria would be short-lived. The victory at Jericho was about to be followed by shocking defeat. The momentum of conquest was about to slam into the immovable obstacle of sin within the camp. They had learned that God fights for his people when they walk in obedience. They were about to learn, painfully and at the cost of innocent lives, what happens when that obedience is compromised. The walls of Jericho had fallen, but something else was about to fall. The assumption that victory was automatic, that God's presence guaranteed success regardless of the people's faithfulness. The conquest would continue, but not without painful lessons about the cost of disobedience and the necessity of holiness. The euphoria of Jericho's fall lingered in the Israelite camp like morning mist. The impossible had been accomplished. The first fortress of Canaan had collapsed at a shout, the walls reduced to rubble by divine power rather than human siegecraft. Confidence surged through the ranks. If God could bring down Jericho without conventional warfare, what city could stand against them? The conquest seemed assured, the outcome inevitable. Joshua sent scouts to survey the next target, a small town called Ai, located in the hill country east of Bethel. The reconnaissance party returned with a report that should have sounded alarms, but instead fed the dangerous assumption that victory was now automatic. Do not have all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not make the whole people toil up there, for they are few. The arrogance embedded in that advice is striking. Ai was insignificant, hardly worth the full army's attention. 2,000 or 3,000 men would suffice. Why trouble the whole nation with such a minor obstacle? The scouts had assessed Ai's military strength, but failed to assess Israel's spiritual condition. They had counted the enemy's soldiers, but not examined their own hearts. They assumed God's blessing was permanent, irrevocable, guaranteed regardless of their faithfulness. Joshua accepted their counsel and sent approximately 3,000 men to attack Ai. The force marched up into the hill country, confident of easy victory. They were about to learn that presumption is a more dangerous enemy than fortified cities. The men of Ai came out to meet Israel's force, and what should have been a simple conquest became a rout. Israel's warriors fled before a numerically inferior enemy. The men of Ai pursued them from the city gate and struck them down on the descent, killing 36 men before Israel's survivors managed to escape. It was not a massive casualty count by ancient warfare standards, but the significance was not in the numbers. It was in the fact of defeat itself. Israel had been routed. The army that had marched around Jericho in perfect discipline, that had shouted down walls, that was supposed to be unstoppable because God fought for them. That army had broken and run before a small hill town. The hearts of the people melted and became as water. The psychological impact was devastating. News reached Joshua, and the commander who had stood firm at the Jordan, who had worshipped before the commander of the Lord's army, who had led Israel to victory at Jericho, tore his clothes in anguish. He fell on his face before the Ark of the Covenant, remaining there until evening, he and the elders of Israel with dust on their heads, the posture of profound grief and confusion. Joshua's prayer revealed the depth of his distress. Alas, O Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to give us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? Would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say when Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name? The questions tumbled out. Why bring us here to destroy us? Why not leave us across the Jordan? What will happen when our enemies hear we can be defeated? How will your reputation survive when your people are destroyed? It was anguish mixed with theology, despair wrestling with faith. Joshua was not doubting God's character, but questioning his strategy. The defeat at Ai seemed to contradict everything God had promised about the conquest. The Lord's response was swift and startling. "Stand up! Why have you fallen on your face?" It was almost rebuke. This was not a time for extended prayer, but for immediate action. The problem was not that God had abandoned Israel. The problem was that Israel had violated the covenant. There was sin in the camp, and until it was addressed, no amount of prayer would restore God's blessing. Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, because they have become devoted for destruction. I will be with you no more, unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. The diagnosis was clear and terrifying. Someone had taken from Jericho what had been devoted to God. The harem had been violated. Items that should have been destroyed or placed in the Lord's treasury had been stolen and hidden. And because of one person's sin, the entire nation had been affected. Corporate guilt was not metaphor. When one member violated the covenant, the whole community bore consequences. The holiness of God could not coexist with hidden sin, and his presence would be withdrawn until the matter was addressed. The remedy was specific. Sanctify the people and say, Sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, for thus says the Lord, God of Israel, there are devoted things in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the devoted things from among you. 3 double quotes. The process would be systematic. Tribe by tribe, clan by clan, household by household, God would identify the guilty party through the casting of lots, a method of divine selection that left no room for human manipulation or false accusation. The sacred lot would point unerringly to the one who had sinned, and that person and everything belonging to him would be devoted to destruction. The next morning, Israel assembled with dread weighing on every heart. Every man knew in his conscience whether he had taken anything from Jericho, but even the innocent must have felt the tension. Someone among them had brought this disaster, and until the guilty party was identified, all were under suspicion. The process began. The tribe of Judah was taken. Among the 12 tribes the lot fell on Judah. Then the clans of Judah came forward, and the clan of the Zerahites was taken. Then the households of the Zerahites and the household of Zabdi was taken. Then Zabdi's household came forward man by man, and the lot fell on Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah. The identification was complete. Achan stood exposed before Joshua and the assembly, the finger of God pointing directly at him. But Joshua, even in this moment of judgment, gave Achan opportunity to confess, to acknowledge what he had done, to glorify God by admitting the truth. My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. The use of my son is striking, fatherly even in discipline, grief rather than rage in the address. Joshua understood that what was about to happen was tragic necessity, that this was the consequence of sin's corrupting power, that judgment was required not from vindictiveness but from the demands of holiness. Achan's confession came with the weight of inevitability. Truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw, among the spoil, a beautiful cloak from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, then I coveted them and took them. And see, they are hidden in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath. The progression was classic. Saw, coveted, took, hid. It was the pattern of all sin from Eden forward. Desire conceived through sight, will overriding command, action following temptation, concealment attempting to avoid consequence. The items Achan specified revealed what had tempted him. A beautiful cloak from Shinar, from Babylon, exotic and valuable. 200 shekels of silver, a substantial fortune. A wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, wealth enough to change his family's economic status forever. He had seen them in Jericho and made his choice. While the walls were falling, while judgment was falling on the city, while his comrades were executing God's command to devote everything to destruction, Achan was looting, and he had hidden his theft in his tent, believing that what was buried in the earth could be concealed from heaven's sight. Joshua sent messengers who ran to Achan's tent and found everything exactly as he had described. They brought the items to Joshua and all Israel, laying them out before the Lord, physical evidence of the violation, tangible proof of the sin that had cost 36 men their lives and endangered the entire nation. Then Joshua, with all Israel accompanying him, took Achan and the stolen items, the silver, the cloak, the gold, and brought them to the valley of Achor, the valley of trouble. With them came Achan's sons and daughters, his oxen and donkeys and sheep, his tent and all that he had. The judgment would be complete. The family that had benefited from the theft, or at least had lived in the tent where it was hidden, would share in the consequence. The livestock that had been declared devoted to destruction because of proximity to the sin would be destroyed. The severity shocks modern sensibilities. Why execute the family? Why destroy the animals? The answer lies in the ancient understanding of corporate identity and the seriousness of covenant violation. Sin is not merely individual act, but corrupting force that spreads through community and family. The judgment on Achan was also purification of Israel, removal of the cancer before it metastasized further. Joshua spoke words that became the valley's namesake. Why did you bring trouble on us? The Lord brings trouble on you today. Then all Israel stoned Achan and his family. They burned their bodies with fire and stoned them with stones. Over the site they raised a great heap of stones that remained as testimony to what happens when covenant is violated, when devoted things are taken, when personal greed trumps communal holiness. The Valley of Acre, the Valley of Trouble, became permanent reminder. But remarkably, it would later become prophetic hope. Centuries later, the prophet Hosea would speak of God's future restoration of Israel. And there I will give her vineyards and make the Valley of Achor a door of hope. The place of judgment would become place of redemption. The valley where sin was punished would become the gateway to renewed relationship. It was testimony to the character of God, holy enough to judge sin severely, gracious enough to transform judgment into hope. But on that day, as stones covered Achan's body and smoke rose from the burning, the message was unmistakable. Obedience matters. Holiness is required. Sin has consequences, and God will not overlook covenant violation even in his chosen people. With the sin purged, God's word came to Joshua again. Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, and his people, his city, and his land. The restoration was immediate. God had withdrawn his presence because of sin. Now that sin was addressed, his presence and blessing returned. But this time, the strategy would be different. Jericho had fallen without conventional warfare to demonstrate divine power. Ai would be conquered through strategy and ambush to teach that God works through human planning as well as miraculous intervention. Joshua was to take the entire army, no more sending minimal forces based on human assessment. He was to set an ambush behind the city while the main force drew Ai's defenders out in pursuit. Then the ambush force would take the empty city and set it on fire. When Ai's army saw their city burning, they would be caught between two Israelite forces with nowhere to flee. The plan was executed perfectly. Joshua selected 30,000 mighty men of valour and sent them by night to lie in ambush west of Ai, between Bethel and Ai. The main force positioned itself north of the city. When morning came, Joshua and the elders went to a position in front of Ai, visible to its defenders, presenting themselves as target. The king of Ai saw Israel's army and led his forces out to attack, believing he was facing the same force that had fled before. Joshua and the men with him pretended to be beaten and fled toward the wilderness, drawing Ai's entire army away from the city. Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel. They had all gone out in pursuit, leaving their city undefended, so certain of victory that they abandoned caution. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." Joshua stretched out the javelin, and the men in ambush rose quickly from their position and rushed into the city. They captured it and hurried to set it on fire. When the men of Ai looked back, they saw smoke rising from their city. Their situation became instantly hopeless. Israel's main force turned to attack them. The ambush force came out of the burning city to attack from behind. The army of Ai was caught in a pincer, trapped with no escape, and Israel struck them down until not one remained. The king of Ai was captured alive and brought to Joshua. 12,000 people, all the inhabitants of Ai, were struck down that day. The city was burned, becoming a permanent heap of ruins. The king was hanged on a tree until evening. Then his body was taken down and thrown at the entrance of the city gate, with a great heap of stones piled over it. But unlike Jericho, this time Israel was allowed to take plunder and livestock for themselves. The lesson had been learned. God's specific commands at Jericho regarding the harem had been violated, and severe judgment had resulted. Now, with that lesson seared into their memory, they could be trusted with the spoils of victory. After the conquest of Ai, Joshua led Israel in a ceremony of covenant renewal. They travelled north to the mountains of Gerizim and Ebal near Shechem. the place where Abraham had first received God's promise of the land. There Joshua built an altar of uncut stones, just as Moses had commanded. They offered burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. On the stones of the altar, Joshua wrote a copy of the law of Moses. Then, with half the people standing in front of Mount Gerizim and half in front of Mount Ebal, with the ark and the priests and the Levites between them, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, exactly as Moses had prescribed. Every word that Moses had commanded Joshua read before all the assembly of Israel, including the women and little children and the sojourners who lived among them. It was a powerful moment of recommitment. The defeat at Ai had shaken them. The execution of Achan had sobered them. Now they stood in covenant renewal, reminded that blessing comes through obedience and curse, through rebellion, that they could not take God's presence for granted, that victory required not just military might, but spiritual faithfulness. The lessons of Ai and Achan were painful but necessary. Israel learned that God's holiness is not negotiable, that sin within the camp affects the entire community, that disobedience brings defeat while obedience brings victory. That presumption is dangerous and humility essential, that God sees what is hidden and judges what is concealed, that confession and repentance restore relationship, and that covenant renewal must be regular and intentional. They also learned that God does not abandon his purposes because of human failure. He judges sin, requires repentance, restores relationship, and continues the mission. The conquest would proceed, but it would proceed on God's terms, with Israel walking in obedience and holiness, understanding that their victories came not from their own strength, but from the presence and blessing of the God they served. The heap of stones in the valley of Achor stood as warning. The heap of stones over the king of Ai's body stood as testament to victory restored, and the altar on Mount Ebal stood as a reminder that Israel's future depended on their faithfulness to the covenant. The conquest continued, but Israel carried forward the knowledge that success depended not on military superiority, but on spiritual purity, not on numbers or tactics, but on obedience to the God who had called them to be holy as he is holy. The conquest of Canaan was not a brief campaign, but a prolonged war that would stretch across years, testing Israel's endurance and faith in ways the dramatic victories at Jericho and Ai had not. What began with miraculous walls falling and divine intervention would continue through conventional warfare, strategic alliances, calculated deceptions, and the grinding work of taking territory city by city, region by region, until the land God had promised was secured, though never as completely as the original vision had prescribed. News of Ai's destruction spread as quickly as news of Jericho's fall had. The kings of Canaan faced a choice: unite against the common threat or be picked off individually. Most chose alliance, gathering their forces in coalition, preparing for coordinated resistance against the Israelite invasion. But one group chose a different path: deception rather than confrontation. The Gibeonites, inhabitants of a significant city northwest of Jerusalem, heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai and concluded that military resistance was futile. But they also knew that Israel's God had commanded the destruction of all Canaanite inhabitants. Surrender would mean death, so they crafted an elaborate ruse. Ambassadors arrived at Israel's camp at Gilgal wearing worn-out clothes and patched sandals, carrying dry and crumbly bread, wine in cracked and mended wineskins. They presented themselves as travellers from a distant country who had heard of Israel's God and wished to make a treaty. "We are your servants," they declared. "Come now, make a covenant with us." The deception was clever. God had commanded Israel to destroy the inhabitants of Canaan, but treaties with distant nations were permissible. If the Gibeonites could convince Israel they were from far away, they could secure their survival. The question should have been obvious. Why would distant travellers arrive with provisions that had gone bad during the journey? But Israel made a fatal error. They examined the evidence: the worn sandals, the mouldy bread, the cracked wineskins. They questioned the men. But the text records the critical failure. The men took some of their provisions but did not ask counsel from the Lord. They relied on their own judgment, on circumstantial evidence, on human reasoning. They failed to inquire of God who could have revealed the truth instantly. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant to let them live. The leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them by the Lord God of Israel. It was binding, sacred, unbreakable. 3 days later, Israel discovered the truth. The Gibeonites were not from a distant country but from nearby cities, well within the territory God had commanded them to conquer. The people grumbled against their leaders for being deceived, but the oath could not be violated. Joshua confronted the Gibeonites with their deception, and they confessed, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and did this thing. Their confession revealed knowledge and faith. They knew God had commanded Israel to take the land. They feared the God of Israel more than they feared any human army, and their cunning, while deceptive, had secured their survival. Joshua placed them under a curse. They would become servants, woodcutters, and water carriers for the congregation, and the altar of the Lord. It was servitude, but it was also preservation, and it allowed them to live among Israel, serving the very God they had feared. But the treaty had consequences Israel could not have anticipated. When 5 Amorite kings, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, heard that Gibeon had made peace with Israel, they formed a coalition and marched against Gibeon to punish them for their betrayal. The Gibeonites sent urgent word to Joshua at Gilgal. Do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us. Israel was bound by oath to defend Gibeon. What had been a mistake born of failing to seek God's counsel now became an obligation that would draw them into major conflict. But God turned human error into divine purpose. He spoke to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you. Joshua responded with characteristic decisiveness and remarkable speed. He marched his army all night from Gilgal to Gibeon, covering the distance in darkness, arriving at dawn to catch the coalition forces by surprise. The Lord threw the Amorite armies into confusion before Israel, and the battle became a rout. Israel pursued them through the descent of Beth Horon, striking them down as they fled. Then something extraordinary occurred. As the Amorites fled, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven upon them as far as Azekah, killing them. The text is specific. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Divine intervention joined human warfare. Heaven itself fought against Israel's enemies, but Joshua faced a tactical problem. The day was waning. Darkness would fall soon, and under cover of night the enemy forces could scatter and regroup. What happened next has been debated, analysed, and marvelled at for millennia. Joshua spoke to the Lord in the sight of Israel and then declared, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Aijalon. And they stopped. The sun stood still and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. The text adds emphasis. The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Scientific explanations have been proposed, perhaps a prolonged twilight, perhaps poetic language for victory, perhaps a miracle that suspended natural law. The text treats it as literal, extraordinary, and unique. Whether the earth stopped rotating or the appearance was altered by some other means, the effect was the same. Israel had extended daylight to complete the victory, and Joshua's prayer was answered in a way that demonstrated God's power over creation itself. The 5 kings who had formed the coalition fled and hid in a cave at Makkedah. Joshua ordered the cave sealed with large stones and guards posted, while Israel continued pursuing the Amorite armies. When the slaughter was complete and the surviving enemies had fled into their fortified cities, Joshua returned to deal with the kings. They were brought out of the cave, and Joshua called the commanders of his army forward. "Put your feet on the necks of these kings," he commanded. It was not merely humiliation, but symbolic enactment of complete victory. The gesture declared total subjugation. the reversal of power, the fulfillment of God's promise that he would put Israel's enemies under their feet. Joshua spoke to his commanders, "Do not be afraid or dismayed, be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight." Then the 5 kings were executed, and their bodies hung on trees until evening, after which they were taken down and thrown into the cave where they had hidden, with large stones sealing the entrance as memorial. This victory opened the southern campaign. Joshua pressed the advantage, moving from city to city in a rapid succession: Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir. Each fell before Israel's assault. The text repeats the pattern with almost rhythmic regularity. Joshua conquered the city, struck it with the sword, devoted every person in it to destruction, left none remaining, did to its king as he had done to previous kings. It was systematic, thorough, and brutal. The conquest followed the pattern of Hiram, devoted destruction, though with variations. Sometimes livestock and plunder were taken. Sometimes everything was destroyed. Sometimes cities were burned. Sometimes only their inhabitants were killed and the city left standing. The variations suggest Joshua was receiving specific instructions for each situation, applying divine strategy rather than following a uniform human plan. The southern campaign culminated in a summary statement. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, and the Negeb, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God of Israel commanded. But the conquest was far from complete. The northern kings, learning of the southern campaign's success, formed an even larger coalition. Jabin, king of Hazor, sent word to surrounding rulers, and they gathered with their armies, a vast host, in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. The text emphasizes the overwhelming numerical superiority and the terrifying presence of chariot forces, the ancient world's most fearsome military technology. They encamped together at the waters of Merom, preparing to crush Israel with coordinated might that dwarfed any previous opposition. It was the kind of coalition that should have made Israel quake with fear, the same kind of massive force that had terrified their parents' generation into refusing to enter Canaan 40 years earlier. But this generation had seen Jericho's walls fall. They had witnessed the sun stand still at Gibeon. They had learned that obedience brings victory and that God's presence makes numbers irrelevant. When the Lord spoke to Joshua, the message was familiar. "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them, slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." Joshua's response demonstrated the faith that had defined his leadership. He and his army came suddenly against the northern coalition at the waters of Merom and fell upon them. The Lord gave them into Israel's hand, and they struck them down, pursuing them as far as Great Sidon and Misrephoth-Maim and the valley of Mizpeh eastward. They struck them until he left none remaining. The victory was total. Joshua hamstrung the horses and burned the chariots, removing the temptation to rely on military technology rather than divine power. Israel was learning that their strength came not from horses and chariots, but from the Lord who fought for them. To preserve captured chariots would be to trust in the weapons of the world rather than in the God who had proven himself faithful. Hazor, the head of all those kingdoms, was captured and burned. Its king was struck down. The city that had led the northern coalition was made an example, demonstrating that no fortress, no matter how powerful, could stand against Israel when God fought on their side. The conquest continued for years. The text summarizes, Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. Estimates suggest approximately 7 years of campaigning, though the exact duration is debated. It was not the swift conquest some might have imagined after Jericho's miraculous fall. It was grinding warfare, city after city, battle after battle, the slow and difficult work of taking territory from entrenched enemies. And it was incomplete. The text is honest about this. There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle, For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction, and should receive no mercy but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. The hardening language echoes Pharaoh's hardened heart. God was working judgment through Israel's conquest, and the Canaanite resistance was both their choice and part of divine purpose. They could have sought peace as Gibeon did. Instead, they chose to fight, and their choice led to their destruction. One significant achievement of this period was the defeat of the Anakim, the giants who had terrified the previous generation of Israelites. When the 12 spies had scouted Canaan 40 years earlier, 10 had returned with reports of giants that made them feel like grasshoppers. Only Joshua and Caleb had insisted the land could be taken despite the Anakim's presence. Now Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah and Israel. He devoted them to destruction with their cities. None of the Anakim remained in the land of the people of Israel, though some survived in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Centuries later, a giant from Gath named Goliath would emerge to challenge Israel, a reminder that the conquest had not been completed as thoroughly as commanded. The summary of Joshua's conquest lists 31 defeated kings, from the king of Jericho to the king of Tirzah. Each name represents a battle, a city taken, territory secured. But the list also reveals what was missing. Significant portions of Canaan remained unconquered. The coastal plain held out, controlled by Philistines who would become Israel's primary antagonists in the coming centuries. Jerusalem, though its king was defeated, remained in Jebusite hands and would not be captured until David's reign. Numerous pockets of Canaanite resistance persisted, and God's command to drive out all the inhabitants was never fully executed. The reasons for incomplete conquest are complex. Partial obedience, war weariness, contentment with partial victory, the difficulty of dislodging enemies from fortified positions, the temptation to coexist rather than continue fighting, all likely played roles. God had warned that if Israel failed to drive out the inhabitants completely, those who remained would become thorns in their sides and snares to them. The warning would prove prophetic. The incomplete conquest would lead to centuries of conflict, compromise with pagan practices, and eventually judgment on Israel itself. But in the years of Joshua's active campaigns, the accomplishments were undeniable. The land rested from war, at least temporarily. Major enemy coalitions had been defeated. Key fortresses had fallen. The hill country, the Negeb, the lowland, and the slopes had been struck and conquered. Israel controlled enough territory to begin settlement and establish tribal inheritances. And through it all, one truth had been proven repeatedly. When Israel walked in obedience, when they sought the Lord's counsel, when they trusted his promises and followed his commands, they prevailed. When they relied on their own wisdom or compromised with God's instructions, they faced defeat and discipline. Joshua, now an old man, had led Israel through years of warfare. The soldier leader had proven himself not just in dramatic moments like Jericho and Gibeon, but in the sustained effort of prolonged campaign. He had demonstrated courage in the face of overwhelming opposition, faith when natural circumstances suggested defeat, obedience even when commands seemed difficult or incomplete victory seemed acceptable. The conquest had been neither as quick nor as complete as might have been ideal. But it had been real. The Promised Land was now substantially in Israel's possession. The time had come to shift from conquest to settlement, from warfare to inheritance, from taking the land to dividing it among the tribes. The soldiers' work was largely done. Now came the administrator's task, distributing the inheritance God had promised to Abraham's descendants, ensuring each tribe received its portion, establishing the framework for Israel's life in Canaan. Joshua had led them into the land. Now he would assign them their place within it. Joshua was old, advanced in years, when the Lord spoke to him with words that acknowledged both accomplishment and incompleteness. You are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess. It was statement of fact, not criticism. The conquest had been substantial, but not total. Much had been taken, but much remained. and now the time had come to transition from warfare to inheritance, from conquest to settlement, from taking land to dividing it among the tribes who would call it home. The shift was significant. For 7 years or more, Israel had been united under Joshua's military command, a single army moving through Canaan, taking cities and defeating coalitions. But they were never meant to remain a mobile military force. They were meant to settle, to farm, to build, to establish families and raise children in the land God had promised their ancestors. The tribes needed their inheritances, their specific territories where they would put down roots and develop their own identities, while remaining part of the larger nation. The division process was not arbitrary. God himself determined the boundaries through the casting of the lots, a sacred method that removed human favoritism and political maneuvering from the equation. But before the lots were cast, 2.5 tribes had already received their inheritance. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had requested and been granted territory east of the Jordan, the land that had belonged to Sihon and Og, the Amorite kings defeated before Israel crossed into Canaan proper. Their choice had been pragmatic. The land was good for livestock, and they had large herds and flocks. But it also meant they would live separated from the rest of Israel by the Jordan River, on the frontier, more exposed to enemies from the east. Moses had granted their request on the condition that their fighting men cross the Jordan with their brothers and participate fully in the conquest. They had kept that promise, fighting alongside the other tribes until the land had rest from war. Now, with Joshua's blessing and warning to remain faithful to the Lord, they returned to their families and inheritances across the Jordan. For the remaining 9.5 tribes, the land west of the Jordan needed to be surveyed and divided. Joshua commanded men from each tribe to walk through the land, describe it in writing with its cities, and divide it into 7 portions. Judah would keep its territory in the south, and the house of Joseph, Ephraim and the half-tribe of Manasseh, would keep their territory in the north. The remaining 7 portions would be allocated by lot at Shiloh, before the Lord. Shiloh had become the central gathering place, the location where the tent of meeting was set up. It would remain Israel's religious centre for approximately 300 years, the place where the ark resided, where sacrifices were offered, where the tribes came for the major festivals. Choosing to cast lots there emphasised that this was not merely administrative procedure, but sacred act, conducted in God's presence, determined by his will. But before the general division, one man stepped forward with a specific request. Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, approached Joshua in Gilgal and reminded him of something that had happened 45 years earlier. "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again, as it was in my heart." Caleb and Joshua had been the 2 faithful spies among the 12 sent to scout Canaan. While 10 had returned with evil report, spreading fear and unbelief throughout Israel, only these 2 had insisted the land could be taken despite the giants and fortified cities. For that faith, God had promised that Caleb would enter the land and his descendants would possess it. Now, 45 years later, Caleb was 85 years old. The wilderness wandering, the conquest, the years of warfare, he had endured it all, and he made his request with the vigour of a man half his age. So now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country, of which the Lord spoke on that day, for you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said." The request was remarkable on multiple levels. Caleb was not asking for prime agricultural land already subdued. He was asking for the hill country, specifically the region where the Anakim, the giants, still lived in fortified cities. He was asking for the hardest assignment, the territory that would require continued warfare. and he was doing so at 85 years old with the confidence of a young warrior. His strength was not merely physical, though apparently his vigour had been supernaturally preserved. His strength was faith, the same faith that had enabled him to stand against the majority 45 years earlier, the same confidence in God's promises, the same refusal to be intimidated by obstacles that terrified others. He had wholly followed the Lord, and that complete devotion had sustained him through decades of waiting and warfare. Joshua blessed him and gave him Hebron as inheritance. Hebron, ancient city associated with Abraham, where the patriarchs were buried, the very place where Abraham had purchased the cave of Machpelah as burial site for Sarah. It was historically significant and strategically important, and it was occupied by Anakim, the descendants of the giants who had made the previous generation feel like grasshoppers. Caleb went and drove out the 3 sons of Anak who lived there, Shishai, Ahiman and Talmai. The old warrior, at 85, conquered what had seemed unconquerable 45 years earlier. He proved that with God, age is no barrier, that faith sustained over decades produces victory, that those who wholly follow the Lord will see his promises fulfilled, even if fulfillment requires waiting a lifetime. His testimony became a model. I wholly followed the Lord my God. Not partially, not half-heartedly, not with reservations or compromise. Wholly, completely. Without divided loyalty or wavering commitment. And because he had wholly followed, he wholly inherited. The distribution of land continued. Judah received the first lot, their territory stretching across the southern portion of Canaan. Ephraim and the half-tribe of Manasseh, the descendants of Joseph, received their inheritance in the central hill country. Benjamin received territory between Judah and Ephraim, including the area around Jericho. But the process stalled. 7 tribes had not yet received their inheritance, and Joshua confronted them with a challenge that revealed dangerous complacency. How long will you put off going in to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you? The question cut to the heart of a spiritual problem. The land was theirs by divine promise, but possession required action. They had seen God's power demonstrated repeatedly. They had participated in conquest. But now, with the hardest fighting done and the opportunity before them to claim their inheritance, they hesitated. Perhaps they were comfortable in the camp. Perhaps the work of settlement seemed too difficult. Perhaps they preferred the familiar routine of communal living to the responsibility of establishing independent territories. Joshua's challenge forced them to act. The survey was completed, the land divided into 7 portions, the lots cast at Shiloh before the Lord. Simeon received inheritance within Judah's territory, the 2 tribes sharing the southernmost region. Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali and Dan received their portions, territories stretching from the Jezreel Valley to the northern regions, from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River. But even in inheritance, incompleteness appeared. The tribe of Dan, assigned territory that included Philistine-controlled areas, found the conquest too difficult. Unable to take their full inheritance, they eventually migrated north and captured the city of Leshem, renaming it Dan. The failure to possess fully what God had given would have consequences that rippled through Israel's history. Within the tribal inheritances, special cities were designated for sacred purposes. 6 cities of refuge were established, 3 on each side of the Jordan, where someone who killed another person accidentally could flee for protection from the avenger of blood. These cities represented justice tempered with mercy, providing sanctuary for the unintentional killer, while still maintaining accountability for deliberate murder. The law was specific. If someone killed another without enmity, accidentally and unintentionally, striking with a tool without seeing, or throwing a stone without looking, they could flee to a city of refuge and be protected. They would stand trial before the congregation, and if judged guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, they would remain in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. After that, they could return to their property without fear of vengeance. The cities themselves were strategically located to be accessible from anywhere in the land. Kadesh in Galilee, Shechem in Ephraim, Hebron in Judah on the west side of the Jordan, Bezer in the wilderness, Ramoth in Gilead, and Golan in Bashan on the east side. The system provided both justice for victims and mercy for those who killed without intent, recognizing that not all death requires equal punishment, but all death requires accountability. The theological symbolism was profound. The cities of refuge prefigured Christ, who becomes refuge for sinners fleeing the justice they deserve. The requirement to remain in the city paralleled the Christians' need to remain in Christ. The high priest's death releasing the manslayer pointed to Christ's death releasing those who flee to him for salvation. Ancient civil law carried spiritual meaning that would be fulfilled in the gospel. Beyond the cities of refuge, 48 cities were designated for the Levites, distributed among all the tribes. The tribe of Levi had received no territorial inheritance. The Lord himself was their inheritance, their portion among the tribes, but they needed places to live, pasture lands for their livestock, towns from which they could serve as priests and teachers throughout Israel. The distribution of Levitical cities ensured that every tribe had access to instruction in the law, that the knowledge of God would be maintained throughout the land, that the sacrificial system could function with priests available in every region. It was recognition that spiritual leadership required material support, that those who served at the altar deserved provision, that the tribes benefiting from priestly service should contribute to priestly welfare. The Kehathites, descendants of Aaron, received 13 cities, including cities of refuge. The rest of the Kehathites received 10 cities from other tribes. The Gershonites received 13 cities, and the Merarites received 12. The total of 48 Levitical cities spread throughout Israel's territory represented God's intention that his presence and his law would permeate the entire nation, not be confined to one central location. When the allocation was complete, when every tribe had received its inheritance and the special cities had been designated, the narrator adds a statement of profound theological weight. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. It was a summary of everything that had happened since the Exodus from Egypt. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would possess this land. He had promised Moses that he would bring Israel into a land flowing with milk and honey. He had promised Joshua that every place the sole of his foot would tread would be given to them. And now, with the land divided and the tribes settled in their inheritances, the promise was fulfilled. Not one word had failed, not one promise had proven empty, not one commitment had been abandoned. God's faithfulness had been demonstrated through decades of wandering, through miraculous deliverances, through sustained warfare, through final settlement. What he said he would do, he had done. The theological principle was established for all future generations. God keeps his promises. He may require patience, 40 years of wilderness wandering, 7 years of conquest, a lifetime of faithful service like Caleb's. He may test faith with impossible obstacles like walled cities and giant inhabitants. He may demand obedience as the price of blessing. But what he promises, he delivers. His word does not fail. His commitment does not waver. His faithfulness extends from generation to generation. For Joshua, now very old, the work of dividing the land was essentially complete. The tribes were settled. The Levitical cities were functioning. The cities of refuge were established. The tent of meeting stood at Shiloh, the ark in its place. The sacrificial system operating. Israel had transitioned from nomadic people to settled nation, from wanderers in the wilderness to inhabitants of the promised land. But Joshua understood that possession of the land did not guarantee perpetual blessing. Physical inheritance was only the beginning. Spiritual faithfulness would determine whether they kept what God had given them. The land could be lost as easily as it had been gained, not through military defeat primarily, but through spiritual compromise, through adopting the practices of the nations they had failed to drive out completely, through forgetting the God who had brought them into this place. And so Joshua, veteran of 80 years of service, witnessed to God's faithfulness through 4 decades of wilderness and 7 years of warfare, prepared to give his final charge to the people he had led. The soldier leader was approaching the end of his life. The time had come to pass the torch, to remind Israel of what mattered most, to call them to choose decisively whom they would serve. The land had been divided, the inheritance had been received, the promises had been fulfilled. but the future remained unwritten, dependent on whether Israel would continue in faithfulness to the God who had proven himself faithful to them. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, the aged commander summoned all Israel to hear his final words. He called for their elders and heads, their judges and officers, gathering the leadership of the nation to receive the wisdom of a man who had walked with God for more than a century, who had witnessed miracles that defied nature, who had led them through conquest and settlement, and now stood at the threshold of eternity. Joshua was 110 years old, the same age at which Joseph had died in Egypt centuries earlier. His life had spanned the Exodus, the entire wilderness wandering, and the conquest of Canaan. He had stood beside Moses as aide and successor, had been one of only 2 faithful spies, had led Israel through the Jordan and around Jericho's walls, had commanded armies when the sun stood still, had divided the land among the tribes. Now, feeling the weight of years and the approach of death, he gathered Israel to speak the words that would define his legacy. His first address focused on remembrance and warning. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake, for it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. He reminded them of the foundational truth that had sustained them through every battle. Their victories came not from military superiority, but from divine intervention. God had fought for them. He had given them the land. Every triumph, every conquered city, every defeated king, all were testimony to God's faithfulness, not Israel's strength. But the past was prologue. Joshua's concern was the future, particularly what would happen after his generation died. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. The promise was conditional. God would drive out the remaining inhabitants, but Israel had to continue the work. The conquest was not finished. Enemies still occupied portions of the land. The temptation would be to settle for partial victory, to coexist with those who should have been driven out. Joshua's warning was explicit. Therefore, be very strong to keep, and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God just as you have done to this day. The language was urgent, almost desperate. Strength was required, not primarily physical, but spiritual, moral, covenantal. Strength to obey completely, to turn neither right nor left from God's commands. Strength to resist assimilation, to maintain distinct identity, to refuse the religious practices of surrounding nations. Strength to cling to the Lord with exclusive devotion. Joshua understood what later history would prove. Israel's greatest danger was not military defeat, but spiritual compromise. The nations they failed to drive out would become snares. Their gods would seduce Israel into idolatry. Their practices would corrupt the covenant community. What could not be accomplished by Canaanite armies would be achieved by Canaanite culture. The gradual erosion of Israel's distinct identity and exclusive worship of the Lord. The warning became more severe. Know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you. It was prophecy and warning combined. Compromise would lead to consequences. Incomplete obedience would result in persistent problems. The nations left in the land would not remain passive neighbours. They would become instruments of Israel's downfall, and eventually, if Israel persisted in unfaithfulness, they would lose the very land God had given them. Exile was possible. Judgment would come. The same God who fought for them when they were obedient would fight against them if they proved unfaithful. Then Joshua added personal testimony. And now I am about to go the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one of them has failed. It was the second time this statement appeared in the book of Joshua. The repetition emphasized its importance. God's faithfulness was the bedrock truth upon which everything else rested. Every promise had been kept. Every commitment had been honored. The land had been given. The enemies had been defeated. Israel stood in possession of what God had sworn to their fathers. But the statement contained a warning. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things, until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you, if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them. God's faithfulness worked both ways. He kept his promises of blessing when obedience was maintained. He would also keep his promises of judgment when the covenant was violated. The same reliability that guaranteed blessing guaranteed curse if the terms were broken. Israel could not claim God's protection while rejecting his commands, could not expect his presence while pursuing other gods. Some time later, Joshua gathered all the tribes again, this time at Shechem, the place where Abraham had first received the promise of the land, where Jacob had buried foreign gods under the oak, where Joshua himself had built an altar and read the law after the conquest of Ai. It was a location saturated with covenantal history, the perfect setting for covenant renewal. Joshua's second address began with historical recitation, recounting God's faithfulness from Abraham through the Exodus and conquest. But the recitation began even earlier. Long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. It was a jarring introduction. Your ancestors were idolaters. The great patriarch Abraham had come from a family that worshipped false gods in Mesopotamia. Israel's origin was not spiritual purity, but divine grace. God had chosen Abraham not because of his righteousness, but according to his own purposes. He had called him out of idolatry, given him the promises, and led him to Canaan. Joshua traced the story through Isaac and Jacob, through the descent into Egypt and the Exodus, through the wilderness wandering and the conquest. He emphasized repeatedly that God had given them victory. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Everything was gift. The land, the cities, the agricultural bounty, none of it had been earned or deserved. It was grace from beginning to end, divine favour poured out on a people who had done nothing to merit it except believe the promises and follow the commands. Then came the challenge, the moment that would define the gathering at Shechem and echo through the centuries. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. The call was for exclusive devotion, complete loyalty, the putting away of all other gods, whether the gods of their Mesopotamian ancestors, or the gods of Egypt they had witnessed during slavery, or the gods of Canaan they had encountered in conquest. No divided allegiance, no hedging of spiritual bets, no syncretism that worshipped the Lord while maintaining devotion to other deities. And then Joshua gave them the ultimatum. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Choose this day. The language made clear that neutrality was not an option. Not choosing was choosing. Failure to decisively commit to the Lord was de facto commitment to other gods. Joshua demanded decision, public declaration, concrete commitment, and he led by example with the famous declaration that would be repeated in homes and churches for millennia. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It was personal testimony and family commitment. Whatever others chose, Joshua's household had made their decision. The old soldier, at the end of his life, planted his flag on exclusive worship of the God who had proven himself faithful through a century of experiences. The people responded, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods, For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. Their confession was strong, grounded in testimony. They had seen God's works. They knew his faithfulness. They affirmed their commitment to serve him. But Joshua's response revealed his concern about the depth and durability of their commitment. You are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you, after having done you good. It was almost provocative. You cannot serve him. He is too holy. His standards are too high. His jealousy for exclusive worship is too fierce. Joshua was testing their resolve, making clear the seriousness of the commitment they were making. Serving the Lord was not casual choice, but life-defining covenant. God would not tolerate half-hearted devotion or divided loyalty. The people insisted, "No, but we will serve the Lord." Joshua pressed further, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him." They agreed, "We are witnesses." Then Joshua gave the command, "Then put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel." The presence of foreign gods, even at this covenant renewal ceremony, reveals how deeply syncretism had penetrated. They had idols among them, even as they pledged exclusive devotion to the Lord. Joshua demanded concrete action. Put them away. Destroy them. Remove all competition for God's rightful place. And incline your hearts. The internal commitment must match the external confession. The people made their final affirmation, "The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey." Joshua made a covenant with the people that day at Shechem and wrote these words in the book of the law of God. He took a large stone and set it up under the terebinth tree that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. The stone would serve as witness, having heard all the words the Lord had spoken. It would be testimony against Israel if they dealt falsely with their God. Then Joshua sent the people away, each to his inheritance. The gathering concluded. The covenant was renewed. The choice had been made, at least for this generation. Not long after, Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. They buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. The soldier leader who had crossed the Jordan, conquered Jericho, commanded armies when the sun stood still, and divided the land among the tribes, was laid to rest in the territory he had helped secure. The book of Joshua concludes with two summary statements that reveal both triumph and foreshadowing of future trouble. First, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. As long as those who had witnessed God's mighty acts remained alive, the nation maintained faithfulness. Testimony sustained devotion. Memory produced obedience. But the statement contained implicit warning. What would happen when that generation died? When those who had seen the walls of Jericho fall and the sun stand still at Gibeon were gone? When the eyewitnesses passed away and only second-hand accounts remained? The answer would come in the book of Judges, where the refrain, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes," would describe the spiritual chaos that followed Joshua's death. The second statement provides a final detail. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. Joseph's bones, carried from Egypt at the Exodus as fulfillment of his dying request, had finally found their resting place in the Promised Land. The man who had saved Israel by bringing them to Egypt during famine, who had made his brothers promise to bring his bones back when God visited his people, was now home. It was the completion of a 400-year journey, the fulfillment of faith expressed on a deathbed generations earlier. Joshua's story and the entire conquest narrative found their ultimate meaning not merely in military victory or political establishment, but in theological testimony. Joshua, Yeshua in Hebrew, the same name as Jesus, had led God's people into rest, defeating their enemies, giving them inheritance in the promised land. He was a type, a foreshadowing, a preliminary picture of the greater Joshua who would come. Jesus, whose name means the Lord saves, would lead God's people into greater rest, not temporal peace in an earthly land, but eternal rest in relationship with God. He would defeat greater enemies, not Canaanite armies, but sin, death, and Satan himself. He would give greater inheritance, not territorial portions, but eternal life and adoption as children of God. Where Joshua's conquest was incomplete, leaving enemies in the land, Jesus' victory would be total. Where Joshua could only lead one generation into one land, Jesus would lead all who believe into eternal kingdom. Where Joshua's mediation of covenant renewal was temporary, Jesus' mediation through his own blood would be eternal. Where Joshua died and was buried, Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. The book of Hebrews makes this connection explicit. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Joshua brought physical rest in Canaan. Jesus brings spiritual and eternal rest for all who come to him. Joshua's final charge, "Choose this day whom you will serve," echoes through history to every generation. The choice remains the same: exclusive devotion to God or divided loyalty that ultimately means no loyalty at all, wholehearted commitment or gradual drift into compromise, obedience that brings blessing or disobedience that brings judgment. The old soldier's testimony stands as model. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Personal decision, family commitment, public declaration. It was the testimony of a man who had wholly followed the Lord for more than a century, who had stood firm when others wavered, who had obeyed when commands seemed impossible, who had trusted when circumstances suggested fear, who had led with courage because God had commanded courage. Joshua died, but his legacy endured. He had taken a generation of former slaves and wilderness wanderers and transformed them into a nation established in the promised land. He had demonstrated that God keeps his promises, fights for his people, rewards obedience, and judges disobedience. He had shown that courage comes not from human strength but from divine presence, that victory depends on faithfulness more than numbers, that leadership means both commanding others and obeying God. The land rested from war, at least for a season. The tribes settled into their inheritances. The covenant was renewed at Shechem. The stones stood as witnesses. The testimonies were recorded, and the people, for as long as that generation lived, served the Lord. But the future remained unwritten. Would the next generation choose as Joshua had chosen? Would they wholly follow the Lord as Caleb had done? Would they remember the lessons learned at such cost? That walls fall when God commands, that sins in the camp bring defeat, that incomplete obedience leads to incomplete victory, that God's faithfulness guarantees both blessing for obedience and judgment for rebellion. The soldier who conquered by faith had finished his course. The land he had won would test whether those who inherited it possessed the same faith that had won it. Joshua's story ended, but the story of God's faithfulness and the call to choose him exclusively would continue through every generation until the greater Joshua, Jesus, would come to lead his people into the eternal rest that Canaan could only foreshadow. The charge remained, echoing from Shechem across the centuries. "Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord."